friends, I'm Carrie Jo, and this is Holy Chuckles Podcast, a space where all meets honesty and where God's gentle humor shows up in the people he chooses. So pull up a seat, take a breath, and let's look together for the sacred in the everyday and the quiet laughter of a God who delights in working through our imperfect stories. Last time, we spent time with verse 14 and 15, noticing how certain inner patterns repeat and how urgency can quietly take over. Today, we're moving into verses 16 and 17, where the urgency escalates, where pressure stops guiding and begins overriding, and where we're given clarity about where God stands when what is sacred is no longer honored. Verse 16 and 17. If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." The worshiper tries to restore proper order and reverence. He asks that God's portion be honored first. The worshiper was like, "Sir, if we can just do this the right way, then you can take what you want. It's no skin off my back if you reach in there and get it after you let me do what I need to do properly." But the servant was like, "No, man, we're not doing that. I'm taking what I want and I'm taking it now." That servant refused the request of the worshiper, the request for the worshiper to continue worshiping, sacrificing, following the ritual that God laid out for them. The servant wouldn't compromise, wouldn't discuss it. He just took it. A threat is introduced, and the threat is force. The servant of the priest took the meat by force. This verse marks a turning point. What was interruption and urgency before has now become coercion. Symbolically, remember, servants are those automatic inner patterns, thoughts that feel compulsive, reactions that feel inevitable, urges that bypass choices, pressure that appears out of nowhere. Symbolically, this verse represents the moment when inner pressure stops listening, ignores boundaries, overrides consent, demands compliance. The servant symbolizes an inner pattern that no longer respects the process of alignment. Hand it over now, that represents urgency without wisdom, pressure without care, action without grounding. I'll take it by force. That represents inner override, loss of inner authority, a voice that does not honor the sacred within you. This verse, it shows us when pressure refuses to listen, it has crossed the line from guidance to harm. The servant is not evil. The servant is unregulated pressure. In real life, this verse shows up as feeling pushed, even when something doesn't feel right. Maybe you agree to stay a little longer at work, even though you're already tired and you've already worked 1,000,000 hours. What makes this feel pushed? Nothing dramatic is happening, but it's a subtle sense of don't stop, keep going. Another way this verse shows up in real life, a sense of being overridden internally. You think to yourself, I should take a break, and immediately continue to do what you are doing. What this feels like? Your inner voice is speaking, but you are ignoring it. Another way, pressure that does not allow space or pause. You fill every quiet moment with noise, checking your phone, watching TV, doing something, working from home. When you do this, what's missing? It's a sense that it's okay to stop, even if it's only for a few seconds. You start making decisions made from compulsion instead of clarity. Saying yes to plans because deciding or explaining feels harder. Afterward, you feel neutral or slightly off, maybe even a little irritated because you did something you didn't want to do. You have a feeling of not being satisfied, a feeling of unclarity. This is an inner signal that says this isn't aligned, but yet you ignored it. Another way this shows up in real life is knowing you want quiet time, but turning on a show anyway. What stands out when you do this is the signal is soft. It's not loud. And it's telling you when you do this, this signal is easy to override because you do it again and again and again. This verse highlights the difference between an inner knowing that invites and an inner force that demands. An inner knowing that invites is a gentle thought, like it can wait. Feeling okay if you don't act immediately. Being able to pause and still feel safe. An inner force that demands, feeling irritated at yourself for slowing down, acting to get rid of discomfort. Why verse 16 matters in our life. The servant would answer, no, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. This verse matters because it reveals the moment when inner self-sabotage tries to take control. This verse shows when automatic patterns stop listening. Urgency replaces discernment. Inner reactions try to dominate our choices. Self-sabotaging voices act like they're in charge. This matters because it helps us see something clearly. God does not agree with inner self-sabotage running our lives. Force is not guidance. Override is not alignment. Compulsion is not wisdom. Verse 16 gives us permission to pause and ask, is this leading me or controlling me? Does this honor my worth or dismiss it? This verse teaches us what comes from God invites. It does not threaten. Verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. The literal of this verse, the narrative pauses. God names the behavior clearly as sin. The responsibility is placed on the priests, not the worshipers. Because remember, the worshiper said, hey, let us burn the fat first, and then you can take what you want. The worshiper tried to stop the priest's servant from doing what he was doing. So that responsibility is placed on the priest. The offering itself is what has been dishonored. It wasn't about the fat of the meat. It was about the offering that the worshipers were giving. This verse gives God's verdict on what has been happening between the priests and the worshipers. Symbolically, this verse reveals something essential. God is not neutral about coercion. God does not align with force. God honors what is sacred and vulnerable. The offering that the worshipers were giving to God represents sincerity, vulnerability, intention, the sacred part of the inner life. When God named this as a sin, God said, what diminishes the sacred is not acceptable, and responsibility belongs to the one who causes the harm. This verse restores moral clarity in our life. This verse brings clarity where there was confusion, relief where there was self-blame, validation of inner discomfort, a reclaiming of dignity, permission to trust your discernment. This verse affirms harm is not holiness, pressure is not wisdom, force is not alignment, and it quietly restores self-worth by naming the truth. Now, you know I'm going to tell a story. After reading and studying these verses and, of course, talking to God, I realized some things in my life when it came to these verses, when it came to especially the words, clarity where there is no confusion, relief where there was self-blame, a reclaiming of dignity. My ex-wife and I used to go out and enjoy the restaurants in the DFW area. We drank, and we drank a lot. And what that did was allowed us to kind of loosen up and tell our truths. We opened up a lot to one another. And in that, it became a place of safety, a place of, you know how I feel, an understanding that maybe we had not been through the same things growing up, but we felt the same way in some regard. We felt abandoned. We felt thrown away. We felt looked over. We felt discarded. And we clicked and we instantly came together based on those mutual feelings. We also had a lot of fun. We laughed a lot. We told great stories. We had a lot of fun. But that mutual trauma, that trauma bonding really is what took us over the edge. And one night we're sitting in a restaurant having drinks, probably already 3 sheets to the wind. And my ex-wife looked at me and said, "Let's get married." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Will you marry me? Let's do it. Let's do it like tomorrow." And I was like, "Whoa, wait, hold up. Wait a minute." But then my unworthiness took over, and that pressure took over of, someone wants you, someone loves you, someone wants to spend the rest of their life with you, someone is choosing you. And my thought pattern changed. Instead of realizing this was not alignment, this was pressure, not real feelings. I'm not saying she didn't love me. I'm not saying we didn't have real feelings for one another. But what I'm saying is, in that moment when those feelings were heightened, that's not the time to answer that question. We had not really gotten down to the nitty gritty of things. Not only that, we were two halves making a whole. What I was providing to my ex-wife is what I wanted. I wanted love, care, someone to go out of their way, someone to make me a priority. Those are all the things that I provided. And what she wanted are the things that she provided, which was protection, someone to always stand in front of me when someone was being mean to me. My ex-wife is a tall woman, and she kind of hovered over me, and I felt that protection. But see, protection is not what I needed, because in my life, how I always lived it is, everything will be fine. I don't have to worry. I don't need to be protected. But in her life, that is exactly what she needed. She needed protection. She needed for someone to stand up for her, for someone to, quote unquote, take a bullet for her. That is something she desired, because in her life, she had just been thrown to the wolves. No one ever protected her. And I'm not saying when we were married, I didn't protect her, but I was one half of a whole. I was the nurturer, the one that fed her, provided love and care. And I'm not saying she didn't do that, but she was the other half. She provided that protection, that always thinking that, okay, here we are. I provided that feminine energy, and she provided that masculine energy. If you looked at us, you would think it was going to be the other way around, but that's not accurate. And we even had a conversation one time because in her past relationships, they wanted her to just be that feminine energy. But that's not something she was, because she had to fight. She had to protect. She had to always have her dukes up. And we had a conversation one time and I said, hey, let me tell you something. If you want to take control of this household, I'm okay with that, because that is your personality. I saw exactly who she was. And in my heart of hearts, I knew exactly who I was, even though sometimes I didn't act that way. I knew I was the nurturer. I knew I was the soft one. I am that person that just provides love and comfort. And I'm okay with that. And so learning through these verses that her and I made two halves of a whole was very eye-opening to me. Because how can you expect someone to give you what your desires are, what you want, need from a person when they're only living from one space? And that was a hard realization for me, because I thought I was this perfect partner. I thought I provided everything that this person needed. But because I wasn't healed, because I didn't look at the things that I had been through, I hadn't seen the trauma, I just thought everyone goes through these things. This is the normal way of living. And I ended up just giving, and expecting nothing in return. And when you do that, when you live from a place of you don't fulfill your desires, you don't do the things that you need for you, then you give away, one, the things that you have for you, and you don't find within yourself the things that you're missing. And then you end up being one half of a whole instead of two whole people in a relationship working together against all the odds. And you can't tell me that two halves making one whole is better than two wholes going against all the odds. When I was going through these verses and understanding, I then realized we both did the same thing. We both grasped at what we thought we were missing, instead of saying, hey, you know what? Let's just keep this relationship where it is. Heck, we should have just kept the relationship as friendship and helped each other as friends work on our traumas and healing ourselves, to then really see if a relationship is what we wanted. Instead, each of our unworthiness popped up, and we made a decision based out of pressure, not wisdom, force, not alignment. And we stayed in that unworthiness instead of telling ourselves our individual truth. Why verse 17 matters? When it says the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, at that moment, God said, I do not side with systems, internal or external, that diminish what is sacred. God does not agree with inner self-sabotage. If you're sabotaging yourself, stop it. God does not want you to do it. God does not excuse patterns that override our worth. God does not confuse harm with holiness. And God does not call coercion growth. That offering that the worshipers were giving, it represented sincerity, vulnerability, the sacred inner life. God is aligned with what honors your soul, not with the inner voices that undermine it. This particular verse removes shame and self-blame by making something very clear. The problem is not your worth. The problem is not your desire to grow. The problem is the pattern trying to take over. God names the harm so healing can begin. With that story I just told about my ex-wife and myself, when she came to me and asked for a separation, when we separated, and then I came to her and said, we need to move forward with the divorce. Both of those times, God named the harm so healing could begin. God told us both, you went in as two halves to try to make a whole, and that is not what you should be doing. You should be going in as two wholes to make a unit. And now you have to be separated to heal. And through my hurts, my sadness, I didn't understand that. But now, as I'm healing, again, I've said this on many episodes, I am real time healing while doing this podcast. God said, you will be my living testimony. And right now, when reading this verse, I just read this verse and studied it yesterday and had to understand what was happening. So right now, doing this episode, I'm understanding why God removed my marriage from my life. And God didn't remove us from one another because we did something wrong. God named our harm by going into a marriage as two halves. And he took that harm away and said, you have to heal. You can't go into a marriage being a half of a person. You have to go into a marriage being a whole person. And that is why that separation happened. That is why that divorce happened because God named the harm so that healing could begin. And as soon as we separated, that healing began. As soon as we separated, I started understanding and looking within. So God knew exactly what he was doing. He named that harm so we could begin that healing. Verses 16 and 17 bring us to an important moment of clarity. Verse 16 shows us what it looks like when pressure crosses a line, when urgency stops guiding and starts overriding. Verse 17 changes everything. God steps in and names what is happening, not with confusion, not with silence, but with clarity. Together, these verses remind us that God is aligned with what honors our worth, our discernment, and our inner authority. When something inside us demands control through pressure or fear, it is not speaking with God's voice, because God's voice restores dignity. God's voice protects what is sacred. God's voice never requires us to betray ourselves in order to belong. Where in your life does pressure feel forceful rather than guiding? And what might it look like to trust that God does not agree with that voice taking control? Think about that. Until next time, may you trust the voice that honors your worth, resist what overrides your peace, and remember that what is sacred within you is worth protecting.